Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this program today we'll be discussing the media war that's aimed against Israel and the West. Warm welcome to the programme. And today's guest is all the way from Jerusalem. His name is Professor Richard Landes, Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Communications at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. So, Richard, welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
Richard, you have a very distinguished academic career, been a professor at the University of Boston. Would you like to share with us your background growing up as a Jewish person in the States and how the Lord led you into academia?
Well, I think the most obvious answer to that is that my father was an academic. He was in economic history. Probably his most famous book is called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, Why Some Are So Rich and Some Are So Poor. And I grew up with the question of why the West was such an exceptional culture. At this point, I think both my father and my work would be considered heretical because you're not supposed to, that's too Eurocentric. It's too, it's too triumphalist to talk about the West being an exceptional culture. But I grew up with the question, why the West? And as a result, went into the Middle Ages to look for the origins of it. And I think I found them. Turn of the millennium, year 1000, very intense apocalyptic expectations, according to me, which led to a wave of, among other things, peace movements. So most of my work in medieval history was on the peace of God and its consequences for Europe. And I developed this notion which I call demotic religiosity, which is laid out in a great deal of detail in the Hebrew Bible. It's based on principles like the dignity of manual labor, equality before the law, direct communication between the individual and God, access to the text, and so on. And you have this demotic religiosity reappearing constantly throughout Christian history, but particularly starting in the 11th century with this peace movement, which eventually leads to a number of heretical movements in the Middle Ages, like the Waldensians, the Hussites and so on, and finally the Protestant Reformation. And so as a result, I think that a lot of what most modern historians, including I think my father, viewed as sort of something that happens in the early modern period and is related to secularism is actually a secular version of this demotic religiosity. So that's how I got into this kind of material. I mean, I was always a Zionist, went to Israel in '67 at the age of 18, right after the war. I thought I was going during the war, but it didn't last very long.
6 days.
Yeah, 6 days. And and then when 2000 hit, I basically changed my profession from medievalist to media critic because I was just stunned by how the media covered the conflict. So that's a sort of short version of.
I appreciate that, and you're famous for coining the phrase Pollywood, which we'll be discussing in this program. Right. So let's start off with how much do you think that the Second Intifada in 2000 was a game changer in terms of media manipulation by the Palestinians against Israel, and essentially turning Western media against the nation of Israel, which has resulted in a huge rise of anti-Semitism across Europe and across the Western world as a consequence?
No, absolutely a key game changer. I just completed my manuscript of a book entitled They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid, A Medievalist Guide to the 21st Century. And I think there's no question in my mind that the coverage of the Second Intifada by the mainstream news media in the West was a catastrophe. It was a catastrophe for Israel. It was an even greater catastrophe for the West. I mean, that's the irony. I've also coined, as a result of working on Pallywood, the term lethal journalism, which is, as I define it, reporting war propaganda from one side as news. And that's what the journalists were doing. They were essentially reporting Palestinian war propaganda as news, most famous examples being Muhammad Adura, the boy who was shot allegedly shot in Netzarim Junction in the Gaza Strip 2 days after Sharon visited the Temple Mount. We'll come back to that. The Jenin massacre 2 years later. I have chapters on each of these incidents. And the way the media covered it. And it was like a feeding frenzy. It was like, I call it moral schadenfreude. It's like the thrill of reporting news of Jews behaving badly. They're just, you know, not just amongst the journalists, but amongst many of their audience, there's this just excitement. Nobody cares what the Palestinians do to their own people. But they do care about any story that has Israelis behaving badly. And so I coined the term lethal journalism, and then I began to think more about it, and I began to realize in the West, this is really own goal war journalism. In other words, the Western journalists, BBC's good example, The Guardian's a good example. I mean, we're in England, I'll pick those, but there are plenty of other outlets. They're essentially reporting their enemies' news, the jihadis' war propaganda, as news to their own people. And that, to some extent, illustrates the point of my book, which is it's hard to get stupider. And yet, because the media was convinced that what happened in 2000 was a nationalist Palestinian uprising of freedom fighters who wanted independence against a colonial oppressive state that refused to give it to them, they completely misread what had happened. What happened in October of 2000 was the first campaign of global jihad against the West. And Israel was a Western country. And not understanding that, and in some senses, almost thinking if we separate ourselves from Israel, if we show that we're pro-Palestinian, maybe they'll like us. No, they don't like you. I had a French friend who was in Morocco during the anti-Bush demonstrations of early 2003. And he wrote to me, he said, the Moroccans think that the French are weak. And I said, why? And he said, because they're siding with their enemies and attacking their friends. You know, they could see what the West was doing. The West couldn't see it for the life of them. I met, at the same time, I met these French journalists who were telling me, courage is attacking the strongest, and the US is the strongest. And I said, no, courage is attacking people who will kill you if you criticize them, not people who won't. And, you know, you pretend, you sort of virtue signal, look how brave I am, I'm attacking the United States.
Absolutely. But should we put the Second Intifada in context? Because only a couple of months earlier, the leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, was essentially given almost the entire, an entire Palestinian state with Judea and Samaria, and even East Jerusalem as a capital future Palestinian state. And yet he walked away from that at Camp David and essentially launched a terrorism war against Israel, to the extent I don't think any Western country has experienced what Israel went through during the almost 20 years ago, in which we had almost daily suicide bombings, attack on buses and cafes, absolutely horrific kind of terrorism warfare that occurred. Why do you think the media didn't really, mainstream media as a whole, didn't actually report that particular story?
So they did report it, but look, One of the chapters in my book is, this is the sort of medievalist guide on the issue of honor and shame. And we're, as a culture, we've sort of shifted from honor and shame. It's not that we don't want honor and want to avoid shame, but we're not willing to kill for it. But in an honor-shame culture, you not only are expected, you're even required to kill. And if you don't kill for the sake of your honor, you've lost your honor, which is a huge and devastating situation in an honor-shame culture. So I think the West systematically, and even the Israelis were involved here, systematically misread the Oslo peace process. For them, it was a positive-sum deal, land for peace, both sides win, and we get on with our lives. And it seems so obvious to people. There's Gavin Esler and Esler at the BBC once said, you know, it's so obvious you could solve it with an email. You know, so it seems so obvious to Westerners who were, modern Western culture is committed to positive-sum relations, that Arafat would accept this. All the signs coming from Arafat were the opposite. His Hudaybiyah speech in Johannesburg, where he said, this is, basically he said, this is a war process. We're gonna go along with this, it's a Trojan horse, and when the time comes, we'll come out of the horse. So, and even the Israeli intelligence services were sort of so committed to the peace process that they overlooked this stuff. So when Arafat said no, people were shocked, except for people like me who had been following this stuff and not in denial over it. So the whole peace process was more or less from the start a lost affair. Nobody wanted to admit that. And so when the war broke out, if the left in particular, who had urged Israel to take all these chances to let Arafat back in, to let him arm his allegedly police force, which became, you know, a dozen security forces armed to the teeth and so on, and who kept saying, don't make us think about this, don't complain about that, because you'll queer the peace process. If when this had blown up in everybody's face, they had said, we got it wrong and we're sorry, the 21st century would look very differently. But instead, what you had, and I'm calling this in my book Y2K Mind, because it happens in 2000, they blamed Israel for the outbreak of the Intifada. Al-Dura plays a key role in this, but essentially, Israel got blamed for Palestinian aggression. And that has become, if you will, the sort of pattern of thought of the 21st century, which has a spillover into the West, which is when jihadis aggress Westerners, you blame the Westerners. And the first example was Israel, but it's become, and then 9/11, you know, Noam Chomsky says we're worse terrorists than they are.
Absolutely. So let's have a look now at this excellent video that you produced called Pollywood, and looking at the media manipulation behind those events back in 2000.
One prize President Clinton will not take with him when he leaves office in January is peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. He tried, but it just didn't work out. In fact, what's happening over there right now is looking more and more like a war, the latest Arab-Israeli war. The fiercest battles in the Middle East were waged right here at the crossroad, at that army post which is there to protect the settlement, which is the focal point of Palestinian rage. In this one tiny area, which Palestinians now call the Martyrs' Junction, more than 30 were killed and hundreds were wounded.
Millions of viewers watch this in-depth news report. Scenes like these of action and injury are broadcast all over the world. Flashed on the screen in dramatic sight bites, presented in a larger storyline, they're a major source of information about the enduring Arab-Israeli conflict. And yet, something is amiss, something that escapes the attention of news editors and viewers alike. Let's examine these images in their original context, the raw footage from which reporters and news editors piece together their stories. Most of the scenes you're about to see were filmed by Palestinian cameramen working independently, employed and equipped by Western news agencies at Netzarim Junction in the Gaza Strip on September 30th, 2000. The Israeli police station is here. The Palestinian here. Next to the Israeli position, there's a factory, twice as tall as the Israeli post. Behind are two residential towers known as the Twins. Palestinian and Israeli policemen had been doing joint patrols as stipulated in the Oslo Accords. On this day, angry crowds with stones and Molotov cocktails gathered at the junction, attacked the Israeli outpost, and were joined by Palestinian police firing their guns. This scene, apparently of a Palestinian man shot by Israelis and evacuated in an ambulance, was captured by a Palestinian cameraman working for French public television, Channel 2. A shot rings out. The man falls to the ground clutching his right leg. The ambulance pulls up in seconds. Fortunately, we can see this scene caught from a different angle by another Palestinian cameraman working for a major news agency. We see three men, apparently under fire, drag the wounded man roughly across the pavement toward the back of the ambulance. But if they were under fire, why did the ambulance stop so far short of the man, forcing the others to drag him back, rather than move forward and protect him from the fire? And if he were injured, is this a way to evacuate an injured man? But wait, he was supposedly hit on the right side of the right leg, presumably by a bullet. And yet, as they load him on the stretcher, we see no trace of blood on that side of his right leg. And then the medics load him on the supposedly injured leg, without sign of protest from the casualty himself. Could this scene have been staged? Could the immediate appearance of the ambulance have come on cue? This case is not clear. It could be real, it could be staged. The media, however, assumed it was real and made it news.
15 heures, tout vient de basculer près de l'implantation de Netzarim dans la bande de Gaza.
Let us consider another battle scene filmed that day, or possibly the day after. A Palestinian gunman fires into a hole in the wall. It looks like a tense moment of house-to-house fighting. We would assume he's firing at the Israelis. He is firing in their direction, but he can't be firing at them. Here he is, on the far side of the factory building, completely out of range of the Israeli position. Are Israeli soldiers inside the factory? All witnesses concur. They never left their fortified position.
It's extraordinary, the extent of media manipulation that we see there. Richard, that's superb work that you put together, incredible research and details. The obvious question that comes from this is how can our Western media be so dumb as to just constantly lap up this Palestinian propaganda and present this as news?
Well, there are generally three explanations that are given. One is the ideological one, which is that, you know, being liberals, I think that's badly misused when applied to the media. Being liberals and progressives, they're on the side of the little guy, what Michael Prell calls underdogism or underdogma. So they side with the little guy. It doesn't, the fact that, for example, the word intifada is not uprising, it's the shaking of the skin of a giant beast shaking off a fly. So the fact that the Palestinians consider themselves part of the Ummah and that they're shaking off the Israeli fly doesn't compute with the Israeli Goliath, the Palestinian David. They're committed to that paradigm. So one case is this, but you know, you would think that at most maybe 20% of the journalists would line up with that. The other explanation is that they are afraid. that there's an enormous amount of intimidation. There are very serious threats. You cannot operate in Palestinian territory without following their rules. And so what you end up, and I think that that's a better explanation. It's like, you know, a magnet under the table. The filings on the surface of the table look like the ideological position, but in fact, the controlling force here is the intimidation. And then the explanation of sort of, no, we're siding with the underdog and so on is actually a fig leaf to deal with the fact that they are not only giving it into intimidation, but not letting us know that that's the case. In fact, they're in total denial of this. So I think that and when you try and talk to journalists about this, they're indignant. We risk our lives. These are brave people. How can you say such a thing? Look, you risk your lives and you reduce the risk by following the rules according to the Palestinians. You reduce it enormously. And why, you know, Israel's the only place in the world where you can be a pregnant war correspondent because it's a safe place to be. And if you criticize the Israelis, you know, the most you'll get is the Israelis whine. They love to say, oh, we're intimidated by the Israelis too, and they shoot these journalists and so on. The evidence is very thin on the ground for that kind of stuff. And the evidence is overwhelming that, you know, people literally, journalists literally lie, misreport, deliberately misreport, and don't suffer any consequences.
Richard, in terms of the Palestinian media strategy, kind of links up with the whole jihadi strategy against the West. And that is you putting women and children in danger, also using asymmetrical warfare as a means of actually bringing on an Israeli attack against civilians and then presenting this as a deliberate Israeli attack on civilians, which is designed to influence public opinion in Western governments. So ultimately then that results in a change of foreign policy in favor of the Palestinians. And it's also using emotional intelligence. All those videos we saw there is to pull people's heartstrings, to touch people emotionally. How and why have the Palestinians been so effective regarding this ever since really the first Intifada in 1987?
Right. Well, again, I think that we're dealing with this issue of sympathy for the underdog combined with this really unfortunate, seemingly almost insatiable appetite amongst Westerners, and particularly Western progressives, for stories about Jews behaving badly. I mean, terrible things are happening in Syria, not interested. On the other hand, John Donison of the BBC will actually retweet a picture of a Syrian girl as a Gazan who's been killed by or injured by Israelis, right? And when he's caught, he apologizes. But, you know, this is his bread and butter is showing how the Israelis victimize the Palestinians. What people like Donison and the other journalists at the BBC and so on don't understand is that when they show these pictures of Palestinians being victimized by Israelis, almost always misleading, if not outright false, like Al-Dura or the Jenin massacre, they think they're showing pictures of Palestinians being victimized by Israelis. They don't understand that in Muslim eyes, these are Muslims being victimized by infidels, and that includes everybody else in the West. So these pictures, Al-Dura in particular, was a wake-up call to jihad across the world. And it's being carried and amplified by Western news agencies. You talk to Arabs and Palestinians about Al-Dura, and they'll say, the whole world saw it. Well, the whole world saw it because the Western media took it as news. And when that news hits, one of the strongest arguments that the jihadis make is we are under assault from the West. They are killing our children. Osama bin Laden used Al-Dura, and he used the killing of children as his excuse for attacking the Twin Towers and stuff. So, you know, there's this desperately dangerous misunderstanding that if you pile on Israel, you're helping the West, whereas it's own-goal journalism. You are running jihadi war propaganda as news, nothing worse.
So let's have a look now at the second part of that video called Pallywood, which features the whole instance regarding Mohammed al-Durrah.
Earlier footage gives us a look inside the hole in the wall. The street fighter is conversing with his comrades inside the room he will soon be spraying with gunfire. A large crowd, mostly civilians, and a few men in military garb, mills around as Palestinian soldiers climb in and out of the hole in the wall. Note the civilians giving orders to a military man. Does this look like a war zone? Orders come to clear the area. Military men line up as if they're taking cover, but from what? Not Israeli bullets. And now the street fighter runs up to the hole in the wall and fires into the empty room. The raw footage clearly indicates a staged scene. A sight bite became news. Consider a third scene. This funeral procession was filmed by an Israeli reconnaissance drone in the aftermath of a military operation in Jenin in April 2002. Palestinian sources claim that the Israelis had massacred hundreds of civilians and that they had to bury their dead. In this particular case, the men accidentally tipped the funeral bier, dropping the corpse. When they regroup, the corpse climbs back on the bier. Later, a crowd has joined the procession. The pallbearers drop the man again. The crowd scatters, frightened perhaps at seeing the dead man stir with life. But the pallbearers regroup, the corpse climbs forthrightly on the bier. And once again, they wrap him in the winding sheet. Welcome to Pallywood. Pallywood is a bustling industry of alfresco cinema, stage news filmed in real time against a backdrop of a complex conflict we all think we know. It has directors, makeup men, sets, extras, often playing dead or injured, props, especially ambulances, plenty of cameramen, and sometimes large audiences. Pallywood operates according to a few basic sequences. One person fakes or exaggerates an injury and attracts a crowd, drawn from the ready and willing onlookers eager to gather at the slightest provocation. Someone waves or whistles, and an ambulance appears as if on cue. Frantic men grab the casualty, sometimes causing further injury, and load him into the ambulance. The hallmarks of Pallywood are casualties that look more like football players acting for the referee than real injuries, ever-ready ambulances, and rough evacuations that would cripple or kill a truly wounded victim. Why so rough? Those evacuating the wounded seem to be in a panic. But why? Presumably they're under Israeli fire. They certainly act as if they are. But if that were the case, wouldn't they carry the injured away from the Israeli post? Here a group of youths runs with an apparently injured boy away from the Israelis. But when they get to the other side of the highway, an adult grabs the boy from the youths and runs him back to an ambulance waiting right in front of the Israeli post, where people stand around, apparently unafraid of Israeli guns. Consider yet another scene. This young man runs across the road away from the Israelis, carrying what looks like a Molotov cocktail. He hands it off. A red stain on his forehead looks like blood, but his movements betray no sign of injury. He runs into a crowd where he becomes a casualty of war. Note that although he should look like someone with a head injury, he sits firmly, his head held high as the crowd carries him. Note also the France 2 cameraman catching the dramatic sight bite. But now what are they doing? This group rushes him back directly in front of the Israeli post. Here people cluster around, backs to the Israeli guns without the slightest sign of concern, even though they have just evacuated what was presumably a victim of Israeli fire. Are these people in a war zone or on a movie set? This upside-down Pallywood logic is one of the great revelations of the raw footage. When they are not acting, even in the same scenes with the actors, Palestinians show no fear of Israeli guns.
Absolutely extraordinary. Certainly brings back a lot of memories. Watching the news coverage at the time, the TV news reports, the newspaper reports, and which this was used to demonize Israel. But essentially isn't, with that kind of reporting, with that kind of almost Hollywood acting, essentially putting Western journalism under serious threat in terms of media integrity, news integrity.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinary, and the unwillingness of the Western media to identify this, to deal with it. First of all, initially I was shocked. I had seen a lot of the footage that's used in that. I had seen with a fellow named Nachum Shachaf, who had done the investigation of Al-Dura, and as part of his investigation, he asked all the reporters, all the news media that were there, to bring him footage, and he got Reuters footage, and most of that footage is from Reuters. So I knew they faked it, but it wasn't until I was watching the footage of Talal Abu Rahme, who was working for France 2 and who shot the Mohammed Adua scene, with Charles Andelin, who was the reporter who reported it, the correspondent, that we're watching all these fake scenes, and at one point it was just so silly. I said, you know, this is weird. It all looks fake. And Andelin, this professional journalist who is an Israeli and who served in the Israeli army and the spokesman's unit and stuff, which is why he was credible when he claimed that this was real footage, said, oh yeah, they do that all the time. It's a cultural thing. So, like, talk about Orientalism. But that's when the word Pallywood came to me, because I realized that it wasn't just that they were faking it, it's that the Western media had no problem using it. And Andelin later justified it by saying, look, it corresponded to what was happening. In other words, just because it was fake didn't mean the same thing happened with that the fake stuff about Bush. You know, the fake document from his commander that came out just before the 2004 election, and it proved to be a fake, and the New York Times ran a headline called Fake But Accurate. You know, so it's fake but accurate, so we use it. And what they're saying is it's accurate because it suits our frame, and so we use it. And the tragic thing is that if the media had paid attention to this, we wouldn't have had what happened subsequently every 2 years after Israel left Gaza, with, you know, these explosions of media frenzies about Palestinian suffering, much of which was just plain faked. And we just saw it again with you know, a month ago with the border stuff. You know, Palestinians are saying 16 dead and 1,500 injured. What? 1,500 injured? Injured doing what? With what? Bullets? What are you talking about? Nobody asked any questions. Everybody just reported it. They reported it as coming from the Palestinian, the health ministry, which is a Hamas operation. So they're reporting Hamas propaganda as news. And, you know, the BDS people are going crazy in the West and going, look, the Israelis are killers and stuff. Astonishing stuff. And there's no learning curve. It's a flat learning curve. They behaved last month. It was like a regression to 2002.
Absolutely. We've got some raw archive footage from the Mohammed al-Dura incident, which was very poignant, primarily because it's when we actually made a documentary about the rise of Jew hatred in Europe. And when I was interviewing many French Jewish leaders and academics, they point this incident as the trigger point that triggered a rise of anti-Semitism in France, and also instigated and incited the French Muslim community to attack the Jewish community. So the responsibility of inaccurate, false media reporting, not checking the facts, but hey, this is making good headlines, has huge implications, doesn't it?
Enormous implications. And part of the, not only did this trigger an initial wave of anti-Semitism, particularly in France, but also in Belgium and, you know, throughout Europe. And ferocious demonstrations, you know, comparing Israel to the Nazis. Essentially what it did was it enabled what had previously been a sort of marginal far-left critique of Zionism as a new form of Nazism. It allowed that to go mainstream. And so all of a sudden you got people like Saramago, Nobel Prize winners, German bishops, walking around comparing the Israelis to the Nazis and so on, which was had a devastating effect. I mean, total moral disorientation. There was a French journalist who said that this death erases, replaces the image of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, it's hard to get more morally disoriented than to think that a cheap fake like this, she didn't know it was a cheap fake, she didn't care, whatever, but one incident where we're talking about a crossfire becomes a symbol that replaces the deliberate murder of 1 million kids and 6 million people. You know, how can you be that stupid? And yet she was, and yet it was widely accepted by people that this is, you know, this is what it's about. And I think that today, the sort of hysteria about Israel, the BDS, the demonstrations, the really crazy stuff where you cannot defend Israel without being immediately dismissed as some kind of crazy right-wing fanatic, originates in this. And Mohammed Adura was the patron saint of the Durban alleged anti-racism, anti-hatred conference that was held by the UN just before 9/11, in which, you know, countries that were still slaveholding black slaves were leading the group against Israel because of allegedly killing this boy. And now you're about to see on scene, he's supposedly dead. Now he lifts up his arm and looks out and down, and Anderlin cut this footage because he didn't want people to realize what was going on. And he said, well, I did it because it was the death throes.
Which has had huge implications, but also, I mean, I remember also in working in 2000 and working in this particular business. It was a call center, and literally on the news was the fact that the Israelis were pulling out of southern Lebanon in 2000. I think that was a couple of months prior, I think May, so it would have been a few months prior to the second Intifada, and literally, you had people saying, oh, I hate these Israelis, they're disgusting. And the moral indignation that it brought upon Israel and the people of Israel with people that knew nothing, absolutely nothing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's the great danger, isn't it? Because we're living in an age of 24/7 news where people want news and information so quickly. They're not prepared to look in the facts, not prepared to check the details, don't read newspapers so much and just get their kind of worldview from the big media broadcasters. Isn't that the danger in showing how shallow our society's become?
Yes, and one of the things that one of the sort of issues that I would point to is the refusal of the media to correct themselves. If you go to the BBC today, you will not find any correction of their coverage of the Jenin massacre. You won't find, same thing with The Guardian. France 2 has never accepted responsibility for the Al-Dura fake. If there were on a regular basis, the media were to correct itself. I have an organization called Second Draft, since journalists claim to be the first draft of history. So we critique, you know, it's like professor grading your paper. Well, they get an F, right? And they continuously get Fs. They don't correct, and they don't admit to the public what's going on.
And also, isn't this down to ignorance as well? I mean, the fact that the news media has moved on so much in the last 20 years in particular, now that because of the impact that the internet has had, you know, before you would have a correspondent for the New York Times and others,
right.
Even some of the smaller newspapers would have correspondents actually in a country like Israel. They'd report on the news, they would understand the country, the history, and actually understand the conflict within its context.
Right.
Now, if there's a major flare-up, everyone follows this international media story, and they all flock there without any knowledge or any information, already preconceived ideas that Israel is wrong automatically, and taking that impression.
Right. So one of the interesting things that happened in 2014 in Operation Protective Edge was what you say, a whole bunch of people, including there was an Indian crew, and there were a number of crews who had never been to Gaza, didn't know what was going on, and they went in there to cover it. And they went in with their sort of, you know, Israeli Goliath, Palestinian David Frame, and so on. And yet, what hadn't happened is they hadn't been socialized by the journalists who were already there. One of the things that has been reported to me by people who deal with the journalists on a regular basis is a number of journalists come to the Middle East and they want to be fair-minded. Within a couple of months, they've been socialized. And part of it is you're not going to get any protection, you're not going to get any help, you're not going to... It's a fraternity of UN people, journalists, and NGOs. And they all hang together and they party together and they party at the roof of the British embassy and so on. And they're all part of this confraternity that accepts this. And they know you don't mess with the Palestinians. So this Indian crew comes and they haven't been socialized. So they're taking pictures of the Palestinians setting up their rockets right next to the hotel room and stuff. They understand that they shouldn't show it because they're in danger, but when they get out, they report it. Same thing with this Barbati, an Italian journalist, who, when he gets out, tweets that, you know, the attack, they killed 10 kids the other day, was not the Israelis, but the Hamas rockets. Because they hadn't been told how they're supposed to report. So I think ignorance is way too easy a thing. At some point, you know, naivete gets so aggressive that you can no longer call it naivete. This is not ignorance. This is either, look, they got their choice between being nasty or being stupid. And what they've got, what you've got here is a situation in which the journalists will not admit that they are being dishonest. They have to protect their reputation. So ultimately, rather than stupidity, I'd call it narcissism.
Yeah. Also, I think it's also very important, whenever I speak to Israelis, and I've got many Israeli friends, they always say that, you know, Israel is part and a victim of this wider jihad against the West. But why is it that our Western media never put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within the context of the so-called kind of war on terror, or the war against Al-Qaeda, the war against ISIS, and yet Israel's on the front line of this war? Right.
So there's a very famous, I think he was British, Oliver Sacks, a neuroscientist, who wrote about a disease in which you actually identify one of your limbs as not being part of you. And you're literally terrified by the fact that this non-member of your body is attached to you. And I think that's how the West has viewed Israel. It wants to believe that the anger against Israel is justified, and if they just, you know, let the jihadis have a go, or let the Palestinian nationalists have a go at Israel, they'll be okay. And what they don't understand is that not only won't they be okay, but by abandoning Israel, they are encouraging the jihadi aggression. And the fact is that one of the things the jihadis have discovered in the course of the 21st century is Europe's an easier target than Israel. So they're actually putting more energy into going after Europe than they are into going after Israel. In fact, people are sort of fed up with the Palestinians. You know, certainly a lot of the Arab countries are showing a lack of enthusiasm for them, but even the jihadis feel that there are much more fruitful venues for attacking the West at this point than going through the Palestinians.
Absolutely. One thing we have to, how does Israel counter this? Because for years people have attacked Israel for their lack of PR abilities, a lack of being able to communicate the truth of what's happening on the ground. But isn't it the reality is that the likes of Hamas, the likes of you know, Hezbollah, and all those terrorist entities that Israel's been engaged in a military conflict over the last decade or so, actually would prefer to have a demonization of Israel in the kind of Western media than actually to win a kind of military offensive against Israel.
Well, they know they can't win.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what happens in an asymmetrical war is if you can't win on the battlefield, then you do cognitive warfare. And cognitive warfare, as my friend Ron Schleifer says, is making patriots of your own people, or even warriors of your own people, and pacifists of your enemy. So they've conducted this brilliantly, but it can only work because the Western media does it. So what can Israel do, or what can we all do? What Israel can do, I've been arguing this for years and getting nowhere, is be more aggressive with the media. They are afraid. There's you know, the term dhimmi is this Arab term for a subject people. The Christians and the Jews are dhimmi. And one of the things that dhimmi don't do is they don't criticize Muslims. So the Israelis, the media is dhimmi to the Palestinians who would threaten them, and the Israelis are dhimmi to the media. They're afraid to criticize the media because they're afraid that the media will be even worse. So they try and win them over. They try to have lunch with them. They give them footage and so on and so forth. They try and be cooperative as much as possible and win them over. That's not going to work because the magnet under the table is what's dealing with. So I think that Israelis need to be more aggressive. I think they need to do a profile. I think every journalist out there that covers the Middle East needs a what I call a Palestinian media compliance index number, which is to what degree do what these journalists report as news match what the Hamas and the PA want them to report. And if we...
Sorry, Richard, we're down to 3 minutes of the program.
Okay, so that's one thing. I think that the Israelis need to be much more aggressive with the media and to show their audiences in the West just how dishonest the media is being about this. Yeah. The other thing is I think it's up to Westerners to start waking up. I mean, there's a really easy out, which is to say, well, there are Jews and Israelis who say that the Palestinians are right. So, well, you can find whatever you want to justify a position. But if you're wrong, you're in real trouble. I mean, one of the themes of my book is, look, you may say, oh, well, this is just a Zionist propaganda work and so on. You can say that. You can dismiss what I have to say. But if I'm right, you're screwed.
Absolutely. And very finally, how important is it that there are programs like the Middle East Report? There's also one called the Jerusalem Dateline, produced by CBN, and also The Watchman by Eric Steckelberg, who put the truth about Israel's situation in the Middle East.
Look, I think it's terribly important that as many outlets as possible run this stuff and that people have access to it. And, it should reach as wide an audience, because essentially what you're trying to do is give people access to the very stuff that the mainstream news media is determined not to let them see because it would put them in such a bad light. So yeah, terribly important.
Richard, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report, and thank you for the pioneering academic work in exposing the lies of Western media and the Palestinian propaganda that goes behind it. Thank you so much. And I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East report. We've learned a lesson today, and that is a lesson that we must stand on truth and only report the truth. So we have an understanding of what's going on. And the scriptures say that truth will set us free. So this is very, very important. So we'll leave you with this song, and it's important that we stand for the truth, and that truth is standing with Israel and the Jewish people. So thank you for watching today's Middle East report.
Children run in fear, the sound of sirens is all they hear, as rockets fall when they should be playing outside. Helplessly we watch from afar, our brothers and sisters protect them from harm. We send our love and prayers to all of you. אחינו כל בית ישראל, הנתונים בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. אחינו כל בית ישראל, הנתונים בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. Just open our eyes, but everything we do is seen as wrong. Own the info, do what they want. We'll fight till our children are safe in our arms, to keep the promise of hope alive. אחינו כל בית ישראל, הנתונים בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. אחינו כל בית ישראל, הנתונים בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה.
להיות בכל עם ועם עומד עצמו במדינתו הריבונית, אשר תפתח לרווחה את שערי המולדת לכל יהודי, ותעניק לעם היהודי מעמד של אומה בת-זכויות על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
אחינו כל בית ישראל, הנתונים בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. אחינו כל בית ישראל, הנתונים בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה.
We're just sitting here working on this song that we're trying to get out.
Israel's on our mind right now. We send our love and prayers.
And we send our love and prayers to you.
Not end.
No. Okay.
We send our love and prayers to all of you.
Okay.
All of you. You do.
אחינו כל בית ישראל, הנתונים בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. אחינו כל בית ישראל, الدنيا بتصارع وبعشي بيا